I had always enjoyed the solitude. Maybe that's why when the opportunity came up for me to spend a weekend alone at a remote cabin in the woods, I jumped at it. It sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. No distractions. No people. No noise. The place was located in the woods outside of Balsam, a small town about 2 hours north of where I lived. The owner, a man named Mark, had been renting it out for years to people who wanted to disconnect. I booked it for the weekend, hoping to clear my mind and get some writing done. The cabin had a reputation for being simple, rustic, and peaceful, which was exactly what I was looking for. The drive there was uneventful. I loaded my car with my essentials, mostly books, some snacks, a couple of beers, and my laptop, and left on a Friday afternoon. The weather was calm, with just a slight chill in the air that felt perfect for this time of year. I drove through the small town of Balsam, where everything seemed stuck in time. People waved as I passed, and I realized how much I appreciated the slower pace of life here compared to the busy city where I usually lived. The road leading up to the cabin wasn't paved, just a narrow gravel path that cut through dense forest. My phone lost service about halfway up, which I expected. The cabin was too far off the grid for any signal to reach. I didn't mind, though. In fact, I relished it. After a little over an hour of winding through trees and avoiding potholes, I finally saw the cabin up ahead. It was nestled among towering pines, with a wraparound porch and a large stone chimney puffing a light wisp of smoke. The whole place looked like it had been pulled from an old photograph, simple, unpretentious, and weathered with age. I parked my car near the cabin, grabbed my things, and made my way inside. The door was already unlocked, as Mark had said it would be. The interior was just as simple as the outside: wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with just the basics, and a cozy-looking living room with a couple of chairs and a couch. The smell of pine was everywhere, a fresh, earthy scent that made everything feel even more secluded. I set my stuff down and took a moment to absorb the stillness. There was no sound except the faint rustling of leaves outside. It was the kind of silence that felt like it had weight pressing down on you, but in a good way, if that makes sense. I didn't realize just how much I'd missed that until I was standing there, in the middle of this small, quiet place. I felt like I could breathe. As I unpacked and got settled in, I noticed how remote the cabin really was. There were no neighbors nearby, not even a distant light to suggest anyone lived close by. The road up here had been rough, and I hadn't seen another car for the last 15 minutes of the drive. It was as if the cabin was tucked away from the world, existing on its own in the middle of nowhere. It was around 6 p.m. when I decided to take a walk around the property. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The cool air wrapped around me, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. The trees stood tall, their branches whispering in the wind, and I couldn't help but feel a slight unease. It wasn't that I was scared, just aware of how alone I was. The woods stretched out for miles in every direction, and the only sign of civilization was the faint trail I'd driven up. I made my way toward a small stream I spotted earlier, hoping to explore a little. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the dirt giving way to moss and fallen leaves as I ventured deeper into the trees. The farther I went, the quieter it became. The wind seemed to die down, leaving only the occasional rustle of branches. It felt like I was the only one there, but there was something else too. An odd feeling that maybe I wasn't completely alone. I shook off the thought and pressed on. The stream was just as beautiful as I imagined, its water clear and cool, trickling over smooth rocks. I stood there for a while, watching the water flow. There was a strange sense of peace that came with the sound of the stream, the rhythm of the water flowing over rocks. After a few minutes, I headed back to the cabin, feeling content, though the feeling of being watched hadn't fully left me. I couldn't explain it, but it lingered in the back of my mind, nagging at me. That night, I made a simple dinner, pasta and some canned soup, and settled in for the evening. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, the flames dancing and casting shadows on the walls. I ate in silence, not bothering to turn on the radio or TV. It felt like a luxury to simply exist in the quiet. By the time I finished eating, The night had settled in fully. The sky outside was dark, the stars bright in the absence of city lights. I cleaned up, then grabbed a book to read. It was a novel I'd been meaning to get to for a while, but somehow had never found the time to start. Now, in this remote cabin, I had no excuses. It felt like the perfect place to dive into a new story. Hours passed as I read, and before long, I realized I was getting tired. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was growing colder. I set my book down and headed to bed, pulling the thick blankets over me as I laid down in the quiet of the room. It was only when I turned off the light that I noticed it. A faint creaking sound, as if someone was walking on the porch outside. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or the cabin settling. But then it happened again. This time, I could hear it more clearly. The slow, deliberate steps, almost as if someone was pacing back and forth on the porch. My heart started to race as I listened, straining to hear. I lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of the noise. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was just the wind. But it sounded too human, too deliberate to be either of those. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The creaking stopped for a moment, but then it came back. Closer this time, as if the person was standing just outside the door. I waited a little longer, hoping whatever it was would go away. But the feeling of being watched intensified. The silence in the cabin was deafening now, broken only by the occasional creak of the wood. I had to know what it was. I quietly slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand. I moved as silently as I could, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as I crept toward the door. With one last deep breath, I opened it slowly. The porch was empty. Nothing was there, not even a shadow, just the stillness of the night. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The forest was completely still, the trees silent. The only thing moving was the light from my flashlight, casting strange, long shadows. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish. It had to be the wind, or maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. The feeling of unease slowly faded as I took in the quiet of the night once more. I went back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, making me paranoid. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, but I didn't fall asleep right away. The thought of someone or something being outside just beyond the door kept me awake for a long time. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. It was mid-October when I decided to get away from everything. The stress from work had built up to the point where I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes without feeling overwhelmed. I needed to disconnect. So, I rented a small cabin in the woods, about 3 hours from my hometown. The kind of cabin you only hear about in old stories, the ones where you're truly isolated. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature and quiet. The perfect place to clear my mind. The drive there was peaceful at first. The trees, starting to show the vibrant colors of fall, lined the winding road, their branches stretching out like arms, trying to touch each other across the asphalt. The air was fresh, and the temperature was just cool enough to roll the windows down. I was looking forward to the solitude, the quiet. I was 28, and I'd never really experienced complete isolation before. This trip was supposed to be my reset. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The place was exactly as described. A small, one-story wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch. It sat on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call in the distance. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp air, and felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was what I needed. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin smelled of pine wood and something else I couldn't quite place, like old books, mixed with the scent of damp earth. It was cozy, with a few mismatched chairs around a wooden table, a well-worn rug in the center, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used for many winters. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove and an old fridge that hummed quietly in the corner. The place had character. I set my bags down on the bed, which was covered with a faded quilt, and opened the small window beside it. Outside, the woods seemed to go on forever. There was no one for miles, and the closest town was an hour away. The perfect escape. I felt a little buzz of excitement, knowing that for the next few days, I wouldn't have to worry about anything. After unpacking, I decided to make a fire. It took a bit of effort, but soon the flames were crackling, and the warmth filled the cabin. I sat in a chair by the fire with a mug of coffee and just listened to the sounds of the woods outside. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The silence was thick, and every so often, I thought I heard something move outside. At first, I assumed it was just animals, squirrels or deer, but something about it felt different. I brushed it off as my imagination, settling deeper into the chair. I wasn't used to being so alone. The first night passed without incident. I woke up a few times, the shadows in the room unfamiliar, but nothing seemed out of place. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked as if it was settling into its own bones. I reminded myself that these were just the sounds of an old building and the surrounding wilderness. It was easy to forget that the world outside was so vast and untamed when all I had was the warmth of the fire and the soft, comforting noises of the night. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the trees outside. I stretched, feeling the weight of the last few weeks slowly lift from my shoulders. It felt good to not have to rush anywhere, to not have a schedule to follow. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The air was crisp and fresh, and the path was well-worn but not overly trafficked. The leaves crunched under my boots as I walked, the forest enveloping me in its quiet. I could feel the absence of civilization in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The path began to feel less natural, like it had been altered in some way. The trees around me grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long shadows across the ground. There were no animal sounds here, no chirping birds or rustling leaves. It was too quiet. I stopped walking, listening, trying to figure out what was wrong. But the more I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was a bizarre sensation. I shook it off and decided to turn back. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. A footprint. It was large, and it seemed to have been made recently, the dirt still slightly disturbed. I crouched down to get a closer look. It wasn't the kind of print I was used to seeing in the woods. No bear or deer tracks, just a large, round indentation in the earth, almost like a boot print but too big for any boot I'd ever seen. I stood up quickly, a feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I hadn't noticed when it had gotten so quiet again, but now the silence seemed louder than before. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart starting to race. When I arrived, I locked the door behind me, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was in a cabin in the middle of the woods. Of course, I was going to get jumpy. But something told me it wasn't just that. That afternoon, I spent some time reading in front of the fire. I kept my phone turned off, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange feeling in the woods. But as night fell, the unease returned. The shadows outside seemed darker, deeper, and the wind had picked up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was outside. The faint crunch of footsteps on the leaves, soft but distinct. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and I sat in the dark, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it started again, closer this time. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was knew I was awake. I didn't know what to do. I considered grabbing a weapon, but I didn't have anything nearby. The fireplace poker was too far away. I silently moved to the window and peered out through the small gap between the curtains. But there was nothing. The clearing outside was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stayed up for the rest of the night, listening for any sounds. Every little creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made my heart skip a beat. But as the hours passed, nothing happened. The footsteps, if they had been real, had stopped. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. I hadn't slept, but I had to leave the cabin. I had to get out. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to double-check the cabin. As I walked out onto the porch, I glanced around one last time. The woods were still quiet. But then, just as I was about to get into my car, I noticed something. The same footprint from yesterday was just outside the door. But now there were more, dozens of them. They circled the cabin, leading into the trees and then disappearing. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. I didn't hesitate. I got in my car and drove off, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't look back. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My friends and I had planned a trip to a remote cabin tucked away in the woods for a weekend of peace, relaxation, and a bit of hiking. The idea of being away from the hustle and bustle of daily life felt like the perfect way to recharge. It was early fall. The leaves had started to turn golden, and the air had a crisp bite to it that made it feel like everything was fresh and new. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a part of West Virginia where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sort of place where the only sounds you'd hear at night were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had rented the place online after seeing a couple of photos, nothing fancy, but exactly what we were looking for. A simple, secluded cabin with a fireplace, a porch with a view, and a couple of old wooden rocking chairs on it. A place to get away from everything. The website mentioned how the cabin had been built in the 1960s, and from the photos it looked like it hadn't changed much since then. I liked that. It was part of its charm. I packed my bags the night before the trip, feeling excited but also a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, but I chalked it up to the nerves I always get before heading into unfamiliar places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't dread, just a sense of something unknown lurking just under the surface. The drive there was long, about 4 hours from the city, and the road narrowed the further we went. We passed small towns, then dirt roads, and eventually found ourselves on a gravel path that twisted through dense woods. My friend, Ben, who had driven most of the way, was starting to get a little irritated. He'd had a rough week at work, and I could tell the winding roads were testing his patience. The sun was setting by the time we finally reached the cabin, and the darkening sky made the place look even more isolated. There were no other houses in sight. I wasn't sure if I liked that or not, but it was too late to turn back now. I was eager to get inside, unpack, and start the weekend. We parked the car in front of the cabin and unloaded our things. The cabin looked exactly as I had remembered from the pictures. A 2-story wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney, and large windows that let in a lot of light. The porch was covered with a thick layer of dust, but it still had its charm. The kind of charm you'd expect from a place that had seen many seasons, but had remained mostly untouched by time. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood and a slight musky scent that I couldn't place. The living room was modest, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden coffee table, and a couple of worn-out sofas. There was a small kitchen to the left, and a staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. The wood beams in the ceiling were dark, and the floor creaked under our footsteps. It felt like a place frozen in time, and in some strange way I liked that. We set up for the night, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked our food and drinks. Ben opened a few beers, and we all sat around the fire, talking about random stuff. It felt good to be away from everything, to just relax and enjoy the company. The weather outside had turned cooler, and the wind started to pick up, making the trees outside sway and groan. That's when I started feeling it, the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind of silence that feels a bit too heavy. It wasn't like the world had stopped, but more like something was missing. I shook it off, though. I was just being paranoid, I thought. The others were all having a good time, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin the mood. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each took one. I ended up in the larger room at the front of the cabin, with a big window that faced the woods. The curtains were heavy, and I pulled them shut before lying down. The bed was comfortable enough, but the creaking of the old wooden frame kept me tossing and turning. I found myself staring out the window in the dark, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, but the peace didn't last long. I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. It was the kind of sound that made you sit up straight in bed, heart pounding. I froze, listening. The house was silent again. I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe an animal outside, or a branch hitting the roof. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was nagging at me. I kept hearing small noises, the kind you might ignore in a normal house, but in a place this isolated, they felt amplified. A few hours passed, and I finally fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was still cold, but the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale orange light over everything. I rubbed my eyes and sat up in bed, feeling groggy. I decided to head downstairs to make some coffee. Ben was already in the kitchen making breakfast. He looked tired, his face pale. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, without looking up from the stove. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't told anyone about the noises, but hearing him bring it up made me feel a little less crazy. "Yeah, actually, a few weird sounds, like something bumping against the house." Ben nodded. "Same here. I thought it was an animal, but I don't know. It didn't sound like that." We shrugged it off, though. It was probably just the house settling or an animal in the woods. Nothing to get worked up over. The day passed uneventfully. We went for a hike up the nearby trail, passing through dense forest, and even stumbled upon a small stream where we stopped for a bit. It was a beautiful spot, quiet and serene. We talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being away from the city. That night, we made a big dinner, grilled steaks and vegetables over the fire. The night sky was clear, and we spent a few hours sitting outside, watching the stars. But again, as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It was like something was watching us, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. We all went to bed early that night, and I tried to sleep as quickly as I could. But it wasn't long before the noises started again. First, a small knock, then another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house felt too still, too quiet. I got up and went to check the windows. Nothing outside. No animals, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But I still couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched from the shadows of the trees, even though I knew that was impossible. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if it was just the trees causing the strange sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time it was louder, and it definitely came from inside the house. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I didn't care. I had to know what was happening. The house was dark and still, and I moved through it cautiously, shining the light on everything. The kitchen was empty, the living room too. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sound, reaching the basement door at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering from below. I didn't want to go down there. I wanted to turn around, go back upstairs, and pretend this was all in my head. But my legs moved on their own, and I descended into the darkness. What I found in the basement was enough to make me freeze in terror. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a pile of old furniture. Broken chairs, dusty boxes, and an old wooden cabinet. And next to it, there was a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden by the furniture. The dragging noise had come from this door. Someone or something had been moving it. I don't know why, but I walked closer to it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, my flashlight trembling in my grip. With one hard pull, the trapdoor creaked open. Underneath was a narrow, dark space, almost like a crawl space. And in the very center of it, there was something. A bundle, wrapped in a tattered sheet. I couldn't make out what it was at first, but when I shone the flashlight on it, my stomach dropped. It was a pile of old clothes, and under them there was something that looked like a bag. A human-sized bag. a bag that had been sitting there, hidden for who knows how long. I felt my body go numb, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing, and I had to force myself to think clearly. Someone had been down there. Someone had been hiding in the basement, and they had left whatever it was down there. I ran upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps over the blood rushing in my ears. I reached my friends' rooms, waking them up, and we decided to leave. We packed our things in a hurry, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin. The lights were still on, the porch empty. I didn't know what had been hidden under that trapdoor, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't coming back. It had been a long time since I decided to take a break from city life, to get away from everything for a few days. Work had been suffocating me, and I was looking for something simple. Just a cabin, nature, and a bit of quiet. That's why I found myself driving through the winding roads of northern Michigan. The sun setting behind the trees, slowly disappearing behind the horizon. My name is Max. I'm 28 years old, and I've always been someone who enjoyed solitude. I was used to spending time alone, but this trip was different. This was supposed to be a complete reset for me. No calls, no emails, just me, some books, and the stillness of the forest. The cabin was about 2 hours out of town. As I neared the place, the forest seemed to close in around me. I passed a couple of smaller cabins that were scattered here and there, but none of them looked like they were occupied. The road was rough, almost like a trail, winding up through a thick layer of trees, the kind of trees you would expect in a forest that hadn't been disturbed by people in a while. The air was crisp, and I had rolled the windows down to let the fresh smell of pine and damp earth in. When I finally saw the cabin in the distance, it felt like a place I could finally unwind. It was old but looked sturdy, with a wraparound porch that had some wooden rocking chairs on it, and a stack of firewood next to the front door. The paint was faded, but there was something about it that made it look comforting, like a place that had been lived in for years. I parked my car in front, grabbing my duffel bag from the passenger seat. The door creaked open when I pushed it, and I stepped inside. The smell of wood and a slight hint of mildew hit me, but it wasn't unpleasant. It just felt lived in. The cabin had all the essentials: a small living area with a couch, a coffee table, a fireplace, and a small kitchen with an old-fashioned stove. The walls were lined with wooden panels, and the windows looked out into the vast expanse of trees, stretching for miles. I dropped my bag on the floor and wandered around. There was a tiny bathroom tucked behind the kitchen, with a clawfoot tub and a worn-out shower curtain. The bedroom was simple, just a bed with an old quilt on top. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. This was exactly what I needed. I hadn't realized how much I missed the quiet until I heard the silence wrap itself around me. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire in the fireplace, roasted a few marshmallows, and sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch watching the stars. The air was so clear that the sky looked like it was made of thousands of tiny diamonds. It was beautiful. The next day, I went out for a hike. I didn't have any particular trail in mind. I just followed the rough path that led into the woods. The further I went, the quieter it got. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, as if it didn't want to disturb the stillness. The trees were thick here, so close together that the sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt like I was walking through an ancient cathedral, the towering trees acting as pillars, the thick canopy above as the roof. I was gone for several hours, exploring the woods, trying to let my thoughts wander. But by the time I decided to head back to the cabin, a strange unease had settled into me. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something off. Something was wrong. It wasn't the forest itself. It was just, I felt like I was being watched. I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. After all, it had been a while since I'd been alone in a place this remote. But when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I left. The first thing that went through my mind was that I'd simply forgotten to lock it. It wasn't like me to be careless, but it could have happened. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. Everything seemed fine. Nothing was out of place, no signs of forced entry. But then I noticed something else. A faint footprint on the floor just inside the door. It wasn't mine. I knew that for sure because I had been wearing boots when I left, and these prints were barefooted, the shape of the foot too small for mine. My stomach dropped, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. It could have been a mistake, maybe a gust of wind or the door catching on something. I locked the door behind me and went about my evening, trying to shake off the feeling. That night, I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, but it sounded like footsteps. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My heart started pounding in my chest. I knew I should have gone outside to check, but there was something about the idea of facing whatever was out there that made my legs go cold. The footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they had started, but I didn't feel better. I kept hearing small noises, scratching against the door, the shuffle of leaves near the porch. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, staring at the door, trying to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, throwing my things into the car. But as I was about to drive away, I noticed something on the ground in front of the cabin. It was a small object, just a rock, but it was strange because it looked like it had been placed there deliberately. I stepped out of the car to get a better look, and when I bent down, I saw something that made my stomach drop. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figure. It looked like a man, but its features were twisted, like something out of a nightmare. And there, carved into the back of it, was a single word. Leave. That was it. No explanation, no other markings. Just the word leave. I didn't hesitate any longer. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. For the first few miles, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But I didn't look back. I just kept driving until I reached the nearest town. When I stopped at a gas station to fill up, I asked the attendant if he knew anything about the cabin I'd been staying in. He just looked at me, his face hardening a bit, and said, "That place has been abandoned for years. No one stays there anymore. You shouldn't have gone there, especially by yourself." I didn't know what to make of that, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. As I made my way back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, the footprint in the cabin, and the strange carvings. I don't know what happened at that cabin or who or what was out there, but I'll never forget that feeling. The one that told me I wasn't alone, and I shouldn't have been there. I didn't go on another trip like that for a long time. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the forest, or maybe something else. But whatever it was, I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It was early October when I decided to get away. Life had been piling on, and the constant noise of the city was draining me. So, when I saw an ad online for a cabin nestled in the heart of the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The place was remote, isolated, the perfect break from everything. The ad said it was a charming retreat with no cell service, no distractions, just peace and nature, the kind of peace I desperately needed. The cabin was located near a small town called Glenwood, about a 2-hour drive from where I lived in Boulder, Colorado. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I didn't mind. It was just me, a few supplies, and a desire for solitude. The road leading to the cabin was long and winding. The trees grew denser as I went further in, their branches reaching out like hands trying to touch the car. The further I went, the more the world seemed to fade away. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind passed through the trees. A few miles down the road, I lost the paved path and found myself on a dirt trail. I had no idea how far off the grid I really was until I passed the last sign of civilization. An old, weathered road sign that read, "Glenwood 12 miles. I kept going, thinking I'd see the cabin soon. But the drive seemed endless. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was nervous, the kind of nervous you get when you've gone too far and realized you might be in over your head. But there was no turning back. Finally, I saw it, the cabin. At first glance, it looked charming. A log cabin, simple but sturdy, surrounded by towering pines. There was a small porch with a rocking chair that creaked as the wind pushed it. A chimney puffed a faint trail of smoke into the air. It was the picture of solitude, exactly what I had come for. I parked the car and grabbed my bag. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel as I made my way up to the porch. The front door was unlocked, which I thought was a little odd but figured maybe it was normal for remote places like this. I stepped inside, the door creaking on its hinges. The air was musty, but there was something comforting about it, too. The scent of aged wood and nature. I took a moment to absorb my surroundings. The living room had a stone fireplace, a few old armchairs, a worn-out rug, and a wooden coffee table. The kitchen was simple, with a gas stove and a small fridge. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and a door off to the side that I assumed was the bathroom. It was everything I expected. Quiet, rustic, and secluded. I set down my bag and walked around, exploring the cabin. The floors creaked under my weight, and the silence was almost too much to handle at times. I found a small stack of firewood near the hearth, so I decided to get a fire going before the night set in completely. As I was kneeling by the fireplace, I noticed something strange. There was an old, faded painting on the wall above the mantel. It was of a dense forest, dark and foreboding. I couldn't tell if it was just the quality of the painting or something about the image itself, but it gave me an odd feeling, a sense of unease. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks. I had been driving for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to me. I got the fire going and decided to unpack and settle in for the night. I went to bed early, wanting to get a good rest before exploring the woods the next day. The first night was uneventful. The sound of the wind outside and the crackling fire the only company. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was too quiet. No wildlife sounds. No rustling of branches. Just stillness. A kind of heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. I woke up several times throughout the night, but it was nothing more than a fleeting feeling. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. It was bright and crisp, a perfect autumn morning. I got up, made some coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sun rise higher in the sky. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the property. There was a trail that led into the forest behind the cabin. I followed it, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound as I walked deeper into the woods. The trees towered above me, casting long shadows across the trail. The air was cool, but it didn't feel unpleasant. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels scurrying about. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. As I walked, I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once, as if I were being watched. I couldn't explain why, but I had the sense that something was following me, just out of sight. I tried to push the thought from my mind, blaming it on being alone in the woods for the first time in a long while. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I wandered for a while, not really keeping track of time. After an hour or so, I realized I had strayed far from the cabin. The trail had become less distinct, and I had to make an effort to push through the underbrush. When I finally turned to head back, I noticed something strange. The trees seemed denser than before, and the light had taken on a strange, muted quality. It was almost like the sun had been blocked out by a cloud, though I could see no sign of one in the sky. I quickened my pace, but the further I walked, the more I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around me. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I had planned on using it for navigation if I got lost, but now it was just dead weight. Panic began to rise in my chest. My breathing quickened, and I started to jog, hoping to make it back to the cabin before I got even more turned around. I was sure I'd been walking in the right direction, but it was hard to tell. Everything looked the same. Tall trees, thick underbrush, the same dirt trail that seemed to vanish beneath my feet. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. It felt like the woods themselves were closing in on me, pushing me deeper, farther from where I was supposed to be. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees, the cabin. I almost collapsed with relief as I pushed through the brush and made my way back to the porch. As I sat on the steps, catching my breath, I realized something. I hadn't seen any wildlife during my walk. No birds, no squirrels, not even a deer. It was like the forest had been completely still, completely empty. I decided to stay inside the rest of the day. The fire was still burning in the hearth, and the warmth felt like a comfort I desperately needed. But that night, as I sat in the cabin, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I had been so focused on my own unease that I hadn't paid attention to something that was right in front of me. The front door. I didn't lock it when I came in earlier, thinking there was no need. But now I noticed that it was slightly ajar, just a crack, enough for someone or something to slip through unnoticed. My heart raced as I moved toward the door. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the crack, listening. The wind howled outside, but the cabin was silent. I knew I was alone. I had seen no one during my walk, but that door, something about it didn't sit right. I closed it, locking it tight, and then checked all the windows. Everything was secure. I felt like an idiot for getting so worked up over something so simple, but the strange events of the past 24 hours had worn me down. The odd feeling in the woods, the silence, the door. It wasn't until I was lying in bed that night, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread, that I heard it. A knock, soft at first, then louder, came from the direction of the front door. I froze, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knock came again, this time with more force. Someone was out there, but who? No one lived out here. The nearest town was miles away. The only thing out there was wilderness. I lay still, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I open the door? No, I wasn't stupid. Whoever it was could be dangerous. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and shined it around the room, trying to calm myself. But then I heard something else. The sound of something moving around the back of the cabin. Soft footfalls, deliberate. My blood ran cold. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking to greet me. They were watching me. I stayed up the entire night, not daring to move. The noises outside faded, but the terror didn't. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, I took a deep breath and gathered the courage to open the door. No one was there. The porch was empty. Nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. I spent the rest of the day inside, not daring to go back into the woods. I kept the door locked and the windows shut, feeling like I was in a cage. I had come for peace, but I was starting to wonder if I would ever feel safe here again. The next morning, I packed my bags. It had been a long year. A year of endless days that bled together into a haze of mundane moments, stress, and noise. So when I had the chance to take some time off and get away from everything, I took it. I needed it, desperately. My name is Ethan Harper, and I'm 28 years old. I live in Chicago, a city that's loud, fast, and unforgiving. I work as a graphic designer at a small firm, but honestly, I spend most of my time trying to avoid my responsibilities and distract myself with whatever I can. The past few months had been particularly draining. Long hours, personal problems, and the weight of it all was wearing me thin. That's why when a friend of mine, Josh, told me about a cabin his family owned up north, I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin was isolated, situated deep in the woods in northern Wisconsin. Josh swore that it was the perfect place to get away, unwind, and clear your head. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was desperate for a change of scenery, so I booked the trip. The cabin was about a 6-hour drive from Chicago, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The roads leading to it were winding and narrow, the type of roads you don't find on a map unless you really look for them. The trees were thick on both sides, and as the miles passed, I found myself surrounded by nothing but forest. The sun was beginning to set by the time I arrived, and I parked the car outside the cabin, looking around. It was exactly what I had expected. A small, rustic building with a weathered wooden exterior, a wraparound porch, and a stone chimney. There were no other houses nearby, nothing but trees in every direction. It was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bags from the trunk. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and earth. It felt good, the kind of clean air that you only get when you're far from the city. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed that the porch creaked beneath my feet, adding an eerie element to the otherwise tranquil scene. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled old, like wood and dust, with a hint of something else. Something earthy, but not unpleasant. The interior was simple, with wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. It felt cozy in a way, but also a little lonely. I suppose that's the best word for it. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful sense. More like the silence was waiting for something, like it was too still. I dropped my bags by the door and started to explore. There was a small kitchen with an old stove and a fridge that looked like it had been around since the 70s. The living room had a large, overstuffed couch with a few faded throw pillows. I noticed a window looking out over the woods. It was a beautiful view, but there was something unsettling about the sheer emptiness of it. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, and the thought of being so isolated started to feel a little overwhelming. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. One was smaller, and the other had a large, antique-looking bed. I chose the larger room mostly because the bed looked more comfortable. After all, I was here to relax, and a good night's sleep was essential. I unpacked my things and then sat by the window for a while, just watching the forest. As the light faded, I realized how truly dark the woods were. It wasn't like the city, where lights flicker in the distance and the noise of the world hums constantly in the background. Here, there was only darkness and the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I spent the rest of the evening reading a book I'd brought along, but I kept glancing out the window. It was so dark outside now that I couldn't see much of anything beyond the faint outline of trees. The wind had picked up a little, causing the branches to sway in the breeze. It was the kind of night that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world, like the woods were swallowing everything whole. Around 9 p.m., I made myself a simple dinner and ate alone, listening to the sounds of the cabin creaking in the wind. It was a strange feeling, being alone out here. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but something about the isolation started to eat at me. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the cabin seemed to echo even the smallest sound. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. After dinner, I decided to go outside for a bit. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The air had turned colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. I stood there for a while, listening to the night. It felt peaceful at first, but then something changed. A low, distant sound came from deep in the forest. It was hard to describe, just a low, almost rhythmic thudding, like someone was hitting something with a heavy object. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it was. My first thought was that it might be a tree falling, but the sound didn't quite match. It wasn't the crash of a tree breaking apart. It was more like a slow, deliberate thump. My curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the porch, making my way toward the edge of the woods. I didn't go far, just far enough to see the tree line stretch before me. The sound continued, though it was fainter now. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to decide if I should investigate further. But something held me back. The air felt heavier now, and the forest, which had seemed calm earlier, felt oppressive, like it was watching me. I walked back to the cabin, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I locked the door behind me, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The bed was comfortable, but my mind kept racing, thinking about that strange sound. It was probably nothing, just an animal or the wind, right? I eventually fell asleep, but the night didn't stay peaceful for long. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the city, the noise, and the endless demands of work. Just me, a cabin tucked in the woods, and a few days of quiet. At 29, I figured it was time for something different. No distractions, no obligations, just me, nature, and the isolation I had craved for a while. I booked the cabin through an online listing I stumbled upon during one of my late-night internet binges. It was located deep in the woods of Oregon, about 3 hours away from Portland. The cabin itself was small, nothing fancy, but it looked like it had potential. A one-bedroom place with a large stone fireplace, a couple of rocking chairs on the porch, and a view of a serene lake not too far off. The photos were beautiful, the description perfect. When I arrived, the place looked just like the pictures. The air was crisp, a cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting an orange glow over the landscape. The road that led up to the cabin was winding and narrow, and there were no neighbors around for miles. Just trees, lots of trees. I unloaded my car, grabbed my bags, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood and pine. The creaking floorboards gave it an old, lived-in feel, which was exactly what I had been hoping for. I set up my things, lit a fire in the hearth, and sank into one of the armchairs. There was a strange, almost comforting silence here. The kind of silence that you only get when you're far from any other human presence. I was excited. I felt an odd sense of peace, the kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. That night, I made myself a simple dinner, just some pasta and canned sauce, nothing fancy, and ate by the fire. Afterward, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the porch, listening to the sound of the wind through the trees. The lake was barely visible from where I sat, the surface dark and still. I was starting to feel sleepy, so I went inside, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, old, but solid. I pulled the thick quilt over myself and drifted off to sleep to the sound of the wind howling outside. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the trees. I made some coffee, brewed it in an old-fashioned percolator I found in the kitchen, and sat at the small wooden table by the window. The view was gorgeous, the lake shimmering in the early light, surrounded by a ring of trees. I had planned to go for a hike that morning, so after finishing my coffee, I gathered my things, just a bottle of water, my jacket, and a small backpack, and headed out. The path to the lake was well worn, and I figured I'd take the long way around it. The air was fresh, crisp against my skin, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived, and it felt both refreshing and a little unsettling. The isolation was total. As I walked, the path grew more and more uneven, twisting through thick patches of forest. The trees were dense, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. The further I went, the quieter it got, and the more I began to feel watched. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, but it was a nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't one to get paranoid over nothing, but there was something strange about the woods here. The trees seemed older than I'd expected, gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and every now and then, I'd hear something moving through the underbrush. Just an animal, I told myself. But then, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed off. There were faint, barely visible footprints in the dirt, but they weren't mine. They were smaller, almost childlike, but something about them looked wrong. The toes were too sharply defined, and the prints seemed deeper than they should have been. I paused, a cold shiver creeping down my spine. I should have turned around then, but I didn't. Instead, I followed the trail a little longer, curiosity getting the better of me. The path led to a clearing. In the center, there was a large, flat rock, smooth, as though it had been worn down by time. At the far end of the clearing, just past the rock, was a small, half-collapsed shack. It wasn't on any map I'd seen. It looked abandoned, forgotten. I couldn't explain it, but a sense of dread washed over me as I approached it. The shack was small, just a single room with a broken window and a sagging roof. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't want to go inside. It didn't feel right, but something was pulling me toward it. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Carved into the wood was a single word: Watcher. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the word, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard something, a soft crackling noise coming from the trees behind me. It wasn't the wind. No, it was something else. Something moving. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees were still. I could feel my pulse racing, my body telling me to leave, to run back to the cabin. But I didn't. Instead, I took a step back and, against every instinct I had, I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was damp and stale, thick with the smell of rot. There was a rusted, old stove in one corner and a pile of old blankets in the other. On the floor, covered in dust, was a large, faded map. I bent down to get a better look at it. The map was of the area, but it was old, much older than anything I had seen before. What caught my eye, though, was a large X marked near the edge of the map, just outside the lake. I didn't know what it meant, but my gut told me it wasn't good. I grabbed the map, folded it up, and left the shack quickly, my heart racing. As I walked back to the cabin, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the woods watching me. The thought of that word, *watcher*, kept echoing in my mind. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon reading and trying to shake off the weird feeling the morning had left me with. But that night, things took a turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the glass. But as I listened, the tapping grew louder, more persistent. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a tree or some animal, but it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and pulled back the curtains. There was nothing outside, just the dark, empty woods. But the tapping, it had stopped. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay in the darkness, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind, the occasional animal noise, and something else. The sense that I wasn't alone, that I had never been alone. The next morning, I packed my things, determined to leave. The cabin, the woods, everything about it had become too much. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. The car keys I had left on the porch the night before were gone. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, even though I had locked it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my things and quickly drove away, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. As I passed through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, years later, the thought still creeps up on me. The Watcher, I never found out who or what it was, but I know one thing for sure: it was real. It was a late autumn afternoon when I arrived at Timberlake Cabin, a small, isolated wooden house tucked deep into the forest on the edge of the Ozark Mountains. The kind of place people usually go to get away from everything. No phones, no Wi-Fi, just you and nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and the open sky. I decided to take a weekend off, away from the pressures of work and the chaos of daily life. There was something about the thought of being alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere that seemed both calming and exciting. The drive out was long, about 5 hours from where I lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, but the final stretch, when the road narrowed and twisted through thick trees, had an eerie charm to it. By the time I turned onto the dirt driveway leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long, thin shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small but well kept. It had the old-fashioned look of something that had been standing for decades, but it had been freshly painted in a deep green color that blended well with the surrounding pines. There was a porch with a rocking chair on the left, and the front door had a hand-carved sign that read Timberlake in rustic letters. It looked like something straight out of a magazine, exactly what I had imagined when I booked it. The key was left under the doormat, just like the instructions said. I let myself in, the door creaking a little as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood and pine, and I could hear the soft whisper of the wind outside rustling through the trees. I took a moment to look around. The cabin had a cozy charm to it. A stone fireplace sat in the center of the main room, with a few logs already stacked neatly beside it. A small kitchen was tucked off to the side, and a set of stairs led to the second floor, where the bedrooms were. The furniture was simple but comfortable, nothing fancy, just what was needed for a weekend stay. I dropped my bag on the couch and decided to explore a little. The kitchen had a fridge stocked with the basics: eggs, butter, milk, and a couple of frozen meals. The cabinets were full of dishes, mugs, and cookware. The place felt homey, though it was clear no one had lived here permanently for quite some time. There was a slight dustiness to the air, and the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. After settling in, I decided to take a walk around the property. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, with a few trails cutting through the trees. There was a small stream that ran nearby, the sound of the water gurgling softly in the distance. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. There were marks on some of the trees. Not typical scratches from animals or weather, but something deliberate, as if someone had taken a knife or an axe and carved strange symbols into the bark. They weren't anything I could recognize, just lines and shapes that looked out of place in the otherwise natural surroundings. It didn't really feel threatening, but it did make me uneasy. Maybe someone else had been out here recently, though it was hard to imagine who, since the cabin seemed so isolated. I turned back toward the cabin, shaking off the strange feeling. The sun was almost completely gone now, and the shadows were growing longer. I made my way back to the porch, where I sat down in the rocking chair and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The forest seemed to come alive at night, the sounds of animals stirring in the underbrush, the wind howling through the trees. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, I cooked a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and a salad, and then spent the rest of the evening reading a book by the fireplace. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the walls. For a while, I was content. I didn't feel scared, just alone, and that was exactly what I wanted. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something strange. The wind had picked up, and I could hear something tapping on the window. I figured it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It didn't stop. At first, I ignored it, telling myself that it was just nature. But after a while, it began to wear on me. The sound was too constant, too purposeful. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to look outside. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the forest, and the wind had begun to whip through the trees, making them groan and sway. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off. I'd come here to relax, not to let my imagination run wild. But I couldn't help it. The isolation was starting to get to me. I decided to turn in for the night, locking all the doors and windows before heading upstairs to the bedroom. The bed was comfortable, and the thick quilt on top was warm enough to keep out the chill. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept racing, replaying every little sound I'd heard since arriving. The tap on the window, the symbols on the trees, the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It was all too much, and my eyes refused to close. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I was jolted awake by a loud crash downstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to listen. There was nothing but silence. But then, there was another sound, faint, like the creak of a floorboard. I held my breath, waiting. Every instinct told me to stay still, to not make a sound. My hand slowly reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. I didn't know what was down there, but I had to check. I crept down the stairs as quietly as I could, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The house was eerily still, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stood still for a moment, listening. The kitchen was empty, but something felt wrong. The air felt thick, heavy. Then, I noticed it. The door to the back porch was wide open. I hadn't opened it, and I was sure I'd locked it when I went upstairs. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I backed away from the door slowly, trying to think. I couldn't just stay here and wait for whoever or whatever was out there, but I also couldn't risk running into them either. I had to think fast. The only other option I could think of was the small shed out back. It was far enough away that I could make it there without being seen, and it might have something I could use for protection. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept toward the back door. My footsteps were muffled on the wooden floors, but every creak felt like thunder in the silence. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as I tried to steady my breath. When I opened the door just enough to slip through, I saw nothing. The night air was cold against my skin as I quickly made my way to the shed. My flashlight flickered once, then stayed steady. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed to get to the shed and lock myself in. The door to the shed creaked as I pulled it open. Inside, the smell of must and old tools hit me. There were a few gardening tools leaning against the wall and a stack of old firewood in the corner. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, an old axe, and held it tightly in my hands, just in case. I waited. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. But nothing happened. No one came. Eventually, I felt a little ridiculous. The tension in my body slowly started to ease. I didn't know what had caused that strange feeling earlier, or if I had just let my nerves get the better of me. But the silence was comforting again, and I decided to return to the cabin. The walk back was uneventful, and I checked every corner, every shadow, before re-entering the house. When I went back upstairs, I locked the bedroom door behind me and sat by the window, staring out at the darkened trees. By morning, the forest was calm again, the wind still and quiet. The birds had started chirping, and the world outside seemed unchanged. Maybe I had just been overreacting, caught up in the isolation of the cabin and the strange sounds of the night. I stayed another night, though, and by the time I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. But I'd made it through the night, and that was all that mattered. As I drove back down the long dirt road toward the main highway, I glanced over at the cabin one last time. It seemed peaceful now, but something told me I wouldn't be coming back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, a weekend off work, and a secluded cabin in the woods. No distractions, no noise, no responsibilities. Just the quiet and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. That's all I needed. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My boss had been piling on the work, and everything felt like it was moving too fast, too chaotic. So when I found the cabin online, an isolated spot about a 3-hour drive away, deep in the woods, surrounded by nature, with no Wi-Fi and no cell service, I thought it was perfect. A break from everything, a place to reset. The weather forecast said it would be clear and cold. Maybe a bit of rain in the evening, but nothing too bad. Just the kind of weather I liked. Crisp air, a fire in the stove, and a good book to keep me company. I packed my bags, filled up the car with snacks, and set off. The drive out was smooth, the kind of drive where your mind starts to wander and you lose track of time. I passed small towns, stretches of forest, and the occasional farmhouse. The farther I got from civilization, the more isolated it felt. The roads got narrower, and the trees grew thicker around me, towering like giants. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked just like the photos. A small, rustic structure made of wood, tucked away in a grove of tall pines. It was exactly what I had hoped for, peaceful retreat. The owner had left a note on the door with instructions for the lockbox. I opened it, grabbed the key, and let myself in. The cabin had that musty, earthy smell of wood and old pine. Inside, it was simple but cozy. A large stone fireplace sat in the corner, a couch with faded cushions, a wooden table with mismatched chairs. There were shelves filled with books and a small kitchenette with a fridge that hummed quietly. Everything was just as advertised, comfortable though a bit worn, like a place that had been sitting and used for a while. I set my things down, grabbed some wood from the stack outside, and started a fire. As the flames crackled and danced, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The warmth spread through the room, and I could already feel myself unwinding. That first evening was perfect. The rain came, just as the forecast predicted. It was the gentle kind, the kind that makes a soft tapping noise on the roof. I cooked a simple dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and sat by the fire. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my chest. That night, I went to bed early. The sound of the rain, combined with the warmth from the fire, made the cabin feel like a safe little bubble away from everything. I drifted off to sleep quickly, my body still tired from the long drive. The next morning, I woke up to the scent of fresh pine and damp earth. The rain had stopped during the night, but the clouds hung low, casting everything in a soft, gray light. I got up, made some coffee, and stepped outside to stretch my legs. The air was crisp, and the forest felt alive, quiet yet full of movement. The ground was wet, and I noticed a few puddles scattered around the clearing in front of the cabin. I decided to take a walk through the woods. The path behind the cabin was narrow but well-worn, leading deeper into the trees. The walk was peaceful at first. The forest had an eerie stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustle in the leaves or the distant call of a bird. But other than that, it was just me and the woods, and I was starting to relax even more, letting my mind wander. But then, I noticed something strange. There was a section of the forest that didn't look right. The trees seemed to be spaced farther apart than the rest, and the underbrush looked trampled like something or someone had been through recently. It was an odd feeling, like something didn't quite belong. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up on me. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal or the wind, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Still, I pushed through it, continuing along the path until I reached a small clearing. There, I stopped dead in my tracks. In the middle of the clearing, partially covered by fallen branches and leaves, was a small wooden shed. It wasn't on any of the maps or photos I had seen when booking the cabin. It didn't make sense. I walked closer, my heart starting to beat faster. The shed looked old, like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered, and the roof sagged in places. A few broken windows were boarded up, and there was a strange smell in the air, like mildew mixed with something metallic. Against my better judgment, I reached for the door, creaked as I pulled it open, revealing the inside. It was mostly empty, except for some old tools that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. A few rusted shovels, a pickaxe, and some broken buckets scattered across the floor. But what really caught my attention was the corner of the shed. There was something there, something half buried beneath the dirt and leaves. I knelt down, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I brushed away the dirt, I uncovered a small, weathered box. It was covered in grime, but the metal looked old, worn, like it had been there for years. I didn't open it, not at first. I just stared at it, wondering why it was here, why it had been buried in the shed. But the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, as if the forest itself was watching me. I quickly stood up, dusted my hands off, and backed away. I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. My nerves were getting the best of me, and I didn't want to let this strange discovery ruin my peaceful getaway. But the feeling of unease lingered, following me like a shadow as I made my way back. The rest of the day passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the thought of that box in the shed. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and decided not to venture outside again until I left the next day. But I didn't sleep well. Every creak and groan of the cabin, every rustle in the trees, kept me on edge. I kept thinking about that box. What could it have been? Why was it hidden away like that? The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave. But before I did, I couldn't resist going back to the shed one last time. I wanted to see if I was just being paranoid, if maybe it was nothing after all. When I opened the door, the box was gone. I didn't know how to explain it. I had locked the shed the night before, and there was no way anyone else had come by without me noticing. The forest was silent as I stood there, the weight of the mystery pressing down on me. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I grabbed my bags, started the car, and drove away from the cabin. As I left the woods behind, the unease slowly began to fade. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be coming back. It was late October, the kind of fall day where the sun barely cut through the thick clouds, and the wind felt colder than it had any right to. I had always been a fan of nature, even in the off-season. So when a chance came up to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't resist. I needed some time away from work, away from the city, away from everything. A quiet retreat seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I wasn't looking for anything extravagant, just a small cabin tucked into the woods. I found it online, just a small, rustic thing, nothing fancy, but it was isolated enough to give me the peace I craved. The booking was easy, and I had made sure everything was set before arriving. I wasn't expecting luxury, just a simple getaway, maybe to do a little hiking, enjoy some fresh air, and read a few books. The cabin was located somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, near a small, sleepy town called Ashton. The kind of place you wouldn't expect to find on a map unless you were looking for it. I didn't know anyone who had been to this part of the mountains, but the pictures from the listing looked peaceful, exactly what I needed. When I finally arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the silence you get when you're alone in a city, where you're still surrounded by distant sounds of traffic, sirens, or people. This was the kind of silence that wrapped around you, thick and heavy. Even the wind, though strong, seemed muffled here, as though it couldn't fully reach me. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photos. An old, wooden structure with a stone chimney. It had a charm to it, though it was weathered and aged. The paint had chipped off in places, and there were a few uneven spots on the wooden porch. It gave the place character, and I liked it. Inside, it smelled of wood, old wood, but comforting. The air was crisp, and the heater kicked on the moment I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just a living room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a small bedroom with a queen-sized bed. The furniture was simple, nothing special, just functional. The wooden floors creaked when I walked, and the only light came from a single overhead fixture in the living room. I liked it this way. It wasn't fancy, and that was exactly what I was looking for. The first night was peaceful. I spent it reading, letting the crackling fire in the hearth soothe me. I didn't have any particular plans for the next few days, except to enjoy the solitude. As the night wore on, I could hear the wind picking up outside, howling through the trees, but it was all distant noise, nothing to worry about. The house was warm and I was safe inside. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had barely risen, casting a weak light through the small windows. I decided to take a walk through the woods before it got too late. The air was crisp, biting at my skin as I stepped outside. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and made my way toward the trailhead I had seen on the map the host provided. There was a narrow path that led into the woods from the cabin, and I thought it would be a good way to get my bearings. The woods were dense here. The trees stretched high above me, and the underbrush was thick with leaves and vines. I walked slowly, taking in the quiet around me. There was something calming about it, almost surreal. The trail was well-trodden, but I didn't see anyone else around. It felt like I was the only person for miles, which was exactly what I had wanted. I walked for about an hour, winding deeper into the forest. I didn't get far, just far enough to lose sight of the cabin. But when I turned back, I noticed something odd. The woods around me felt different, not in a spooky way, but in a subtle, unsettling manner. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. The wind had picked up, and the rustling of the trees above sounded almost like whispers. I chalked it up to the isolation. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But still, there was this gnawing feeling that wouldn't go away. When I got back to the cabin, I didn't think much more of it. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the silence had gotten to me. Either way, I didn't let it bother me. The next few days were uneventful. though I couldn't shake that odd feeling from the first day. I went on a few more hikes, always returning to the cabin before dusk. The air was getting colder, and the sunsets were stunning, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that quickly faded into darkness. There was something mesmerizing about those sunsets, how quickly the light would disappear, leaving everything in an eerie, early nightfall. By the third night, the feeling of unease had grown. It wasn't just the isolation anymore. It felt like something had shifted in the air. I didn't like to admit it to myself, but it was getting harder to ignore. At night, when I lay in bed, I kept hearing sounds outside. Not the wind, not animals, but something more deliberate. Like footsteps, slow, measured steps. I told myself it was just animals, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me again. The noises seemed to come and go, so I tried to push it out of my mind. But on the fourth night, it was different. The noises were louder, closer. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. There it was again, a slow, deliberate step. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the window, scanning the yard. I saw nothing but darkness, the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. No footprints in the snow, nothing that would suggest someone or something was out there. I didn't sleep well that night. I stayed awake, listening, waiting for the next sound, but it never came. Or maybe I was too exhausted to notice when it did. The next morning, I went outside to check, convinced I'd find some clue, something to explain what had happened. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, the trees were still, and there wasn't a trace of anything unusual. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched never left. It gnawed at me, creeping into my thoughts during the day and haunting my dreams at night. Something about the place didn't sit right with me anymore. I considered leaving early, but I had only one more night left. I wanted to finish the trip, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. That last night, I stayed up again. The fire in the hearth burned low, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The cabin felt colder than it had all week, despite the heater running. The wind howled outside, louder than before, and I could swear I heard something. No, someone moving outside. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer as the night wore on. I grabbed the flashlight once again and went to the door, peering out into the night. This time, I wasn't imagining it. Standing near the edge of the woods was a figure. It was tall, unmoving, and for a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light. But then it shifted just slightly and I saw it clear as day. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. I couldn't think straight. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, no reason for a person to be so far into the woods at this time of night. I grabbed my things, packed as quickly as I could, and drove away. I didn't care about checking out properly or about leaving the place in the condition I found it. I just needed to get out. As I drove down the dirt road leading away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me, just the empty, silent woods stretching out in every direction. I never found out who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was a local who'd wandered too far into the woods. Maybe it was someone else entirely. But the truth is, I don't want to know. The feeling of being watched never left, and I haven't returned to that part of the mountains since. I've told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know something was wrong with that place. It wasn't the isolation. It wasn't the silence. It was something else, something I can't explain. But I don't need to. All I know is that I'm glad I left when I did. It's hard to explain what drew me to that cabin. Maybe it was the promise of solitude, the idea of escaping everything for a weekend. The world, with its constant noise, deadlines, and expectations, was beginning to suffocate me. My name's Jake, and I was 27 at the time, stuck in a dead-end office job in a city that was slowly draining the life out of me. So when I stumbled across a listing for a secluded cabin out in the woods, far from everything, I didn't hesitate. The cabin was in the mountains, about 3 hours from the nearest town. The area was called Pinewood Ridge, and the place had a reputation for being quiet, way too quiet. No one lived nearby, and there weren't any major roads leading to it. Perfect escape. I figured I could disconnect from the digital world, take a few hikes, and just breathe again. The booking was simple enough. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon, packing light, just some clothes, food, and a couple of books to keep me company. The cabin owner, an older guy named Carl, had emailed me directions, warning me that the last stretch of road leading up to the cabin was rough. No problem, I thought. I'd rented a 4x4 for the trip, so it should be fine. As I neared the location, the air grew thick with the scent of pine and earth. I couldn't help but notice how peaceful it was. There wasn't a single sound, except for the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I was on edge for no reason at all. It felt like I was entering a world that had no place for me, like I didn't belong. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend in the road. It was exactly what I imagined. Simple, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. The windows were large, giving the place an almost open feel, and a small porch ran along the front. There was an old wooden swing hanging from the porch beam, creaking faintly in the wind. Carl had left the key in a lockbox just like he said he would. I let myself in, the door creaking slightly as I opened it. The inside was just as rustic as the outside. The walls were made of dark, weathered wood, and there was a small stone fireplace at the far end. The kitchen area was basic but functional, and a small table sat in the center of the room. Upstairs, there was a loft with a large bed and a small window overlooking the forest. First, everything seemed perfect. I unpacked my things, made a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The air was fresh, cool, and still. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you can hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time in forever. But as the evening wore on, that silence started to feel heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I know it sounds cliché, but there was this odd, unsettling pressure in the air. I brushed it off as nerves, telling myself I was just overthinking things. That night, I went to bed early, tired from the long drive. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the cabin's silence made it easy to drift off. But then, just as I was starting to fall into a deep sleep, I heard something. It was a light sound, barely noticeable at first, like something shifting in the woods outside. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath. It came again, a soft rustling sound, followed by what sounded like footsteps. But it wasn't like someone walking. It was more of a dragging noise, slow and deliberate. I got out of bed, feeling uneasy. I peeked out the window, but all I could see was the blackness of the night, broken only by the faint glow of the stars. I grabbed a flashlight, not sure why, but I felt the need to check outside. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. I stood there for a moment, listening. There was nothing, not even the wind. Just an animal, I muttered to myself, shaking my head. It had to be, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of wildlife, after all. Still, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I locked up and went back inside, but sleep didn't come easily after that. Every little creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, made me jump. It wasn't until well past midnight that I finally managed to drift off again. The next morning, the sun was up and the air was crisp. I decided to take a hike, hoping the fresh air would clear my head and help me shake the strange feelings from the night before. The trail started just beyond the cabin, winding up the mountain through dense woods. The walk was peaceful, and I lost myself in the rhythm of my steps, trying to forget about the previous night. I was about an hour into the hike when I came across something strange. A set of footprints, fresh in the mud along the trail. They were large, but they didn't look like anything I had seen before. They weren't human, but they weren't animal tracks either. They had an almost unnatural shape to them, broad at the base, but narrowing as they went forward. They looked like something dragging itself along the ground. I stopped dead in my tracks, a wave of unease washing over me. I should have turned back right then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the trail for a few more minutes, hoping to find something that would explain it. But the footprints stopped abruptly, as though whatever had left them had simply vanished. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself it was just an animal I hadn't recognized. But the tracks were too odd, too deliberate. My thoughts kept returning to the noise I heard last night, the dragging sound. Could they be connected? That night, I decided to stay inside, keeping the windows closed and locking all the doors. I wasn't sure what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. As the night fell, the cabin seemed to settle into an eerie quiet. But then, just like the night before, I heard it again, the dragging sound, slow and purposeful. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Carl, but there was no signal. I pulled out my flashlight and went to the porch, keeping the light trained on the forest in front of me. The trees were still, their branches casting long shadows in the moonlight. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and a strange, hunched posture. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting the figure in and out of view. But each time it appeared, it seemed closer. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Finally, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood frozen for a long time, not sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. The rest of the night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I packed up my things early. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to leave. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was a tiny dot in the distance, and the woods beyond it seemed endless. I didn't return. I'm not sure what I saw that night or what made those strange tracks, but I know one thing for certain. I never want to find out. I never thought I'd find myself alone in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, but that's exactly where I ended up. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a break from the hustle of city life, a chance to unwind. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, work piling up, personal stuff weighing me down, and I needed a way to disconnect. I figured a cabin out in the woods would be perfect. No distractions, just peace and quiet. At least that's what I thought when I first looked at the pictures online. The cabin was located deep in the forest of the Adirondacks, far enough from the nearest town that it seemed like the perfect place to be off the grid. The owner, a man named Paul, had given me the keys with a brief rundown of the place. He seemed nice enough, but there was something a little off about the whole situation. The cabin didn't look like the kind of place you'd expect to see in a tourist brochure. It was old, the kind of place that had been around for decades and probably hadn't seen many updates in the last 20 years. The photos didn't show the dark corners or the worn wooden floors, but I didn't mind. I thought it would add to the charm. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the tree line. The road leading up to the cabin was a dirt track, barely wide enough for my car. The trees on either side seemed to press in, their twisted branches creating a canopy overhead. The forest here was dense, the kind of place where the shadows felt deeper than they should, even in the daylight. As I parked in front of the cabin, I noticed how quiet everything was. No wind rustling through the trees, no birds calling out. It was an eerie silence, the kind you don't notice until you do. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the front door. The wood was weathered and cracked, but it still had a certain rustic charm. I slipped the key into the lock, the metal scraping against the frame, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. A small living room greeted me, furnished with mismatched chairs, a worn-out couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place wasn't filthy, but it was clear no one had really taken care of it. The kitchen was off to the right, with a small wooden table and a stove that looked like it might fall apart if you leaned on it too hard. I set my things down and took a moment to just absorb the space. It felt different than I expected. There was an odd sense of isolation here that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that the cabin was far from civilization. It was as if the woods themselves were closing in around me, like the trees were watching. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and started unpacking. I'd come here to relax, not to get spooked by the setting. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple meal, sat by the fire for a while, and then went to bed. The bed was old, too, the frame creaking under me as I lay down, but it was comfortable enough. I fell asleep easily, the silence of the forest outside lulling me into a deep rest. But that was when things started to feel off. The first time I woke up in the night, I thought it was just a bad dream. My room was cold, the air thick with stillness. I could hear the sound of the wind rustling outside, but there was something else too. A soft thud, like something hitting the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just a tree branch, the kind that might fall when the wind picked up. But then the noise came again. Thud, thud. I lay still, my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness of the room. My heart started to beat faster. I had always been the kind of person who could rationalize things, who could explain away every little noise. But this was different. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then it came again. Thud, thud. I didn't get up to check. I don't know why. Maybe I was too scared, or maybe I was too tired to move. Instead, I just pulled the covers tighter around me and closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound. Eventually, I fell back to sleep, but the noise kept echoing in my mind, even in my dreams. The next morning, I went outside to get some fresh air, hoping the daylight would chase away the unease that had crept in. The sun was shining, the air crisp and cool. It was a perfect day for a hike, so I decided to take a walk through the woods. The trail started just behind the cabin, winding through the trees. It wasn't a marked trail, just something that looked like it had been used by people who knew the area. I walked for hours, trying to clear my head, but the unease stayed with me. There was something about the forest here that felt wrong. It wasn't the beauty of the place. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around me, the way the silence felt like it was pressing down on my chest. I tried to push the feeling aside, reminding myself that I was being irrational, but it was hard to shake. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned orange and pink, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. As I walked up to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I left, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I stepped inside slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Everything seemed normal at first, no signs of anything being disturbed. But then I noticed something on the table in the kitchen. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I didn't remember seeing it there before. I picked it up and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was simple, written in blocky, uneven handwriting. Asterisk, leave now or it will be worse. Asterisk. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. I had no idea what this meant. Who had left the note? Had someone been inside the cabin while I was gone? I looked around the room again, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dust, no broken windows. Nothing that suggested anyone had entered. But that note, it felt wrong, like a warning, and suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to stay here any longer. But the thing was, I wasn't about to just leave. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I'd come here to get away, and I wasn't going to let some strange note make me run. Instead, I locked the door and spent the evening trying to convince myself that it was just a prank, a random act by someone who thought it would be funny to mess with me. That night, I locked every window and every door, double-checking to make sure everything was secure. I didn't hear any strange noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed up late, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread creeping up on me. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I heard it again. The noise. Thud, thud, thud. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from outside the cabin, just on the other side of the wall. I crept over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadow. Just the dark, empty forest. The thuds continued, growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, desperate to find the source of the noise. The air was cold, the ground damp beneath my boots. I shined the light around the yard, scanning every corner, every tree, but there was nothing. The forest was as still as ever. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. That's when I saw it. Near the back of the cabin, where the woods got even denser, there was something strange on the ground. It looked like footprints, large, heavy prints, as if someone had been walking around the cabin, leaving marks in the soft earth. I followed the prints as they led deeper into the woods. My breath quickened as I moved further from the cabin, the darkness swallowing me whole. The noise had stopped, but I still felt like I wasn't alone. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig made my heart race. Eventually, the footprints led me to a clearing, and in the center of it, there was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of logs, stacked neatly, almost like a cairn. But it wasn't just logs. It looked like something had been placed there, something unsettling. I couldn't bring myself to get too close, but I could see enough to know it wasn't just debris from the woods. There was something off about it. And then I heard it again. Thud, thud. The noise was so close now, it was as if it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the dark. But again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the silence, and that damn feeling of being watched. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my feet pounding against the ground. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I packed my bags, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into the car. I didn't even bother to check the cabin one last time. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, the forest shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension